From clay pressed into wet earth 5,000 years ago to king lists that quietly shatter every chronology built since the Sumerians left behind records that still sit just beyond our understanding. Not myths carved as poetry, not legends dressed as fireside stories, but something colder, stranger, more unsettling. Modern culture tends to assume that the earliest stories of humanity were attempts to explain the terrifying and the unknown, lightning floods, death, the cycles of the seasons. Myths, we say, were poetic cloaks thrown over natural forces, symbols, archetypes, humanity's first philosophy. Yet when the Sumerian archives are read slowly, line by line, tablet by tablet, they present something that does not behave like that at all. They describe beings called the Anunnaki, with the same administrative precision used to track grain temple workers, land disputes, and tax obligations. Names, ranks, assigned cities, tasks, failures, arguments, promotions and demotions. These are not vague forces of nature, cloaked in metaphor. They are written the way census takers write about citizens, the way bureaucrats write about officials. In this long exploration, the focus turns to 10 core claims embedded in cuneiform that archaeology even today cannot comfortably confirm and cannot comfortably dismiss. They describe rulers whose reigns run into tens of thousands of years, measured in units no later text bothers to define. They insist that kingship did not rise gradually from human society, but arrived from above, finished and intact. They show gods acting in ways that feel very ungodlike. These gods become hungry. They panic. They flee from disasters they helped unleash. They swear never to repeat what they have done, as though constrained by law rather than standing outside it. The tablets insist that knowledge was not discovered step by step, but handed down fully formed, transferred, not invented. All of this was recorded by the world's first known civilization. A culture that insisted its own story began in the middle of something older, something already organized. Before going deeper, it is worth doing something very simple. Take a moment. Notice where you are. Notice what time it is where you are listening from. This is a long journey, and it is meant to be heard slowly. If you find value in reflections like this, gently supporting the channel, perhaps with a like or a shared thought in the comments after you finish, helps keep these long-form explorations alive. But for now, just listen. The visuals are here to assist, not to dictate the experience. This narrative is built to work from sound alone. Whether you are glued to the screen or simply letting the words drift through a quiet room, allow the outside world to soften at the edges. Let the pace slow. Let questions linger. Because the problem with these Sumerian records is not that we cannot read them. Cuneiform was deciphered in the 19th century. Thousands upon thousands of tablets have been translated, cross-checked, and published. We know what the signs say. The problem is that what they say refuses to fit any of the categories prepared for them. To understand why it is necessary to set aside the famous texts first. Forget for the moment the Epic of Gilgamesh. Forget the great creation myths. Instead, begin with something utterly unromantic. Begin with bookkeeping. Around 3 to 200 BCE in mud-brick cities in southern Mesopotamia, scribes began pressing reed styluses into damp clay, forming the earliest known writing system. They were not crafting literature. They were counting barley rations for workers attached to temples, recording livestock inventories, logging labor assignments. The birth of writing was the birth of bureaucracy. It was cold, exact, relentlessly detailed. These were administrators, not philosophers. Their survival depended on accuracy. A scribe who miscounted grain risked punishment. A scribe who falsified temple accounts risked even worse. And yet buried among these ledgers that track every shekel of silver, every jar of oil, every animal, appears something that does not belong. Systematic records of beings called the Anunnaki, treated not as symbols of natural forces, but as persons with genealogies, job descriptions, and city jurisdictions. They are written beside human officials in the same tone with the same weight. The difficulty is not a mistranslation. The trouble is not technical. The trouble is conceptual. What the Sumerians wrote is too organized to be dismissed as myth, too strange to be accepted as history, and too consistent across cities and centuries to be waved away as literary imagination. It occupies a third space, one for which there is still no name. Consider one object in particular, a tablet in the British Museum, catalogued as WB Day for the Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BCE. On the surface, it resembles a normal royal chronicle. City names, dynasty names, ruler names, reign lengths, all laid out in a dry, sequential, administrative style. Then the numbers appear. The opening line states with no poetic flourish. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. The first king listed is Alulim. His reign is given as 28,800 years. Not as an age, not as countless days, 28,800. The second king, Alolgar, is given 36,000 years. The pattern continues for 8 rulers in total, before the list notes almost casually. Then the flood swept over. After this point, the lengths drop, but not into the realm of possibility. 200 years, 900 years, 600 years. Only much later does the document begin to approach spans that a human lifetime could conceivably contain. For over a century, scholars have circled this text, trying to domesticate it. If these numbers were simply symbolic, why are they delivered in the same stark tone as tax figures? If they emerged from oral traditions, exaggerated over time, why is the numerical structure so precise, so carefully patterned? Why do copies from different cities and eras preserve the same impossible figures? And why does no Sumerian commentary ever pause to explain them? There is no aside. No scribe adds. Of course, these are not literal years. The figures are simply inscribed and left there like a challenge carved into clay. The king list is not alone. Across temple hymns, ritual instructions, and cosmological compositions, the Anunnaki appear again and again, not as foggy divine abstractions, but as individuals with fixed domains. Enki, freshwater wisdom craftsmanship. Enlil, storm wind, political authority. Inanna, love, war evening star. Ninhursag, birth, fertility mountains. These are not just poetic personifications. They behave like offices, like portfolios. The texts show them making decisions, convening assemblies, arguing, policy, splitting jurisdictions. They show them eating, sleeping, tiring from labor. They show them fearing the flood, not commanding it from a place of mythic safety, but running from it, starving after it, and solemnly promising never to repeat it. So the scene is this clay hardened into permanence 5 millennia ago, holding records that will not fold neatly into any category created for ancient thought. The first systematic record keepers on Earth recorded something. Whatever that something was, the framework needed to read it clearly is still missing. This is where the inquiry truly begins. The Sumerian tablets describe a world that did not open with humans at the center. In their telling, humanity steps onto a stage already built, already lit, already staffed. A world where rulers' cities and systems existed before human beings were even conceived. This idea is not tucked away in obscure fragments. It is stated directly. One of the oldest known Sumerian creation accounts, often called the Eridu. Genesis does not open with the forming of people from dust or clay. It begins with the division of the cosmos itself. Heaven, earth, waters, land. The great powers, and Enlil, Enki Ninhursag, divide authority among themselves. Cities are founded, irrigation channels are dug, divine households and temples are established. Only then, almost as a side note, do humans appear. Humanity is not described as the grand goal of creation, not as image bearers, not as rulers given dominion. Humans are introduced as labor, as a practical solution. The gods, exhausted from maintaining cities, fields, and canals, require relief. Another narrative, the Atrahasis epic, sharpens this picture. In that account, a group of lesser gods, the Agigi, are the ones forced to dig canals and maintain the infrastructure. They dig, they carry baskets of earth, they endure the strain of keeping the system running. Eventually, they revolt. They burn their tools. They surround Enlil's temple and demand a different arrangement. The solution is not a bargain. It is not reform. It is replacement. Enki proposes creating humans to absorb the burden. The goddess Belet Ili mixes clay with the blood of a slain god, and from that mixture, humans emerge. Not framed as explorers, not as fellow rulers. The term used is closer to worker, laborer, servant. In this telling, humans do not build the first cities. They inherit them. They do not spark the first irrigation projects. They maintain them. This reverses the narrative most people are taught. The standard story runs like this. Humans invent agriculture. Agriculture creates surplus. Surplus allows for specialization. Specialization leads to cities, and the architecture of civilization emerges from the ground up. Simple to complex. Primitive to advanced. The Sumerian texts invert that sequence. Cities first. Kingship first. Irrigation networks first. Social hierarchy and administration first. Humans are added afterward, brought in to take care of systems already in place. Temple hymns reinforce this perspective. They speak of ancient sanctuaries in Eridu Nippur Ur and Uruk as sites that were already old, even in Sumerian memory. Eridu especially is praised over and over as the first city oldest of all, the seat of Enki before the flood, before kingship, was distributed more widely. Archaeology does confirm Eridu's deep antiquity. Excavations have uncovered multiple construction layers beneath. Later remains some stretching back to about 5400 BCE, long before writing, long before the pyramids. Yet the Sumerian texts do not present Eridu as a simple settlement that gradually became holy. They speak of it as sacred from the beginning, as Enki's personal city, his headquarters, his dwelling. The question that follows is quiet but persistent. If Eridu was already divine before humans were made to work in it, who maintained it before them. The texts do not say, they state, they describe, they do not explain. This pattern repeats across genres. In legal codes, humans are said to receive laws. They are not shown drafting them. In agricultural texts, humans are taught irrigation. They do not stumble upon it. In ritual instructions, humans are passed exact formulas for prayers, precise measurements for offerings, detailed patterns of ritual timing. The picture is clear. Humanity executes procedures that came from somewhere else. At the core of this is the Sumerian concept of the me, a word sometimes translated as divine decrees or cosmic attributes, but those phrases are only approximations. The me are listed as specific countable items: kingship, priesthood, music, weaponry, craftsmanship, writing, truth, victory, even things like descent into the underworld and return from the underworld. Over 100 are mentioned across various texts. Every single one is described as something held first by the gods, then transferred. Not discovered from scratch, not slowly crafted through human experimentation, given. Writing is not presented as an invention. It is a gift. Metalworking does not evolve step by step. It is delivered. Agriculture is not the outcome of trial and error. It is imparted as a complete package. Across historical periods and city-states, the Sumerians describe themselves not as the originators of civilization, but as caretakers of a system whose blueprints came from beyond them. They never say, "We were here first." They never claim, "We invented this." So, a question hangs over every excavated tablet and every translation if the Sumerians describe a structured world existing before humanity. What exactly did they believe they were documenting? Were these fragments of memory from an earlier culture, one that collapsed and left behind? Records or traditions that Sumer tried to preserve? Were these political tools designed to legitimize institutions by anchoring them in a vast, unreachable past? Or were they an attempt to describe something that happened in terms that have become alien? The tablets do not respond. They do not clarify. They simply refuse to behave the way mythology is supposed to behave. The first claim, the foundation on which everything else rests, emerges again and again when these texts are read as a whole. Humans were not here first. Humans were not here first. That statement repeats like a drumbeat. Yet the texts do not stop there. They outline not just a non-human before, but an entire administrative order, a functioning civilization that supposedly operated without us. And that is where the story must go next. In the Sumerian corpus, the pre-human world is not a vague golden age. It is described as a system, a structure. The gods in these accounts are not hovering abstractions. They are present. They live in specific cities. They govern fixed territories. They hold clearly defined roles. One instructive composition is often called the debate between sheep and grain. It describes a time before humanity existed and before grain had been introduced. The Anunnaki during this period are said to know nothing of bread, nothing of woven garments. They exist physically, but without the abundance that later characterizes Mesopotamian life. Then the narrative tells Enki and Enlil create sheep and grain explicitly to feed the Anunnaki. The infrastructure for food production is set in place. Pastoral life and agriculture are arranged first for divine benefit. Only after this is done do humans enter the scene, engineered to take over the farming and herding, so that the gods no longer have to handle the manual work themselves. The same order appears in another text often called Enki and Ninma. There, the Anunnaki are shown digging rivers, piling up silt, exhausting themselves with physical labor. They complain. The goddess Nama carries their complaint to Enki, who proposes a new creation, humans to bear the burden. Again, the tone is not religious exaltation. It reads more like an engineering note. A new class of worker is designed to solve a workload problem. But much of what is most unsettling is not what is said, but what is left unsaid. If Eridu was Enki's city, if Nippur belonged to Enlil, if Uruk was the city of Inanna, who laid the first bricks, who raised the first walls, who cut the first canals for these gods to inhabit. The texts often credit Enki or Enlil with founding or establishing settlements, but the actual process is never described in material detail. Foundations are affirmed. The act itself, building as we understand it, remains out of frame. The cities appear in the narrative already functional. Territorial divisions follow the same pattern. An controls heaven. Enlil governs air and earth's surface. Enki rules the freshwater abyss. Ninhursag presides over highlands and mountains. These are not honors they gradually earn. They are assignments that exist from the beginning. A hymn to Enlil calls him the one whose pronouncements cannot be altered, who determines destinies. His status is not argued for. It is assumed the way one would assume gravity. A property of the world, not a character in a story. Cylinder seals and administrative tablets echo this grounded quality. The gods are not drifting through symbolic space. They appear seated on thrones in recognizable buildings. They receive offerings. They inspect fields. Water flows from Enki's shoulders in some depictions, forming rivers, but he stands before what is clearly a temple, an institutional setting. This is not the style one expects from what is usually labeled myth. There are few overt morals. There is little explicit symbolism. The narratives read more like records of procedure and dispute. That leaves modern readers in an uneasy place. If these sources are not mythology in the way that Greek or Norse stories are mythology, and if they are not history in any way that can be synced with biological or geological timelines, then what kind of text are they? The Sumerians themselves seem dimly aware of the problem. Centuries later, Babylonian scholars copied these older compositions and sometimes added short glosses, little marginal attempts to interpret or clarify. Even so, they did not adjust the core claims. They did not scale down reign lengths. They did not rewrite the structure. They preserved. Meanwhile, the physical record remains stubbornly quiet. No ruins have emerged that clearly point to a pre-human civilization in Mesopotamia. No genetic data from human remains suggests deliberate engineering instead of evolution. No geological traces confirm a managed humanless world running irrigation networks prior to known human activity. But the silence of the material record is just that silence. It does not affirm the Sumerian picture, but it does not directly contradict it either. It simply does not speak to the kind of claims found in those tablets. This is the tension at the heart of the subject. The Sumerians were not guessing. They wrote as if they were recording. They believed themselves to be chronicling a past in which humans arrived late, inheriting a system they did not design, taking up roles they did not choose, implementing laws they did not draft. The issue is not whether this literally happened in the way a modern historian would require. The more revealing question is, why would the earliest known bureaucrats on Earth choose to frame their entire civilization this way? Why would they insist that kingship, the very heart of their political structure, came from somewhere else? To approach that, the narrative has to move from who ruled and who labored to what exactly that kingship was understood to be. The opening line of the Sumerian king list is a small sentence with enormous weight. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It does not say kingship emerged from human society. It does not say it was seized in battle or agreed upon through social contract. It says it came down. It fell. The verb is specific. In administrative and everyday Sumerian, it describes physical movement from a higher place to a lower one, the way rain descends, the way a bird lands. That same word is applied here to political authority itself. Power in this scheme moves downward through space before it moves forward through time. This stands in sharp contrast to other ancient models. Egyptian pharaohs, for instance, are divine by blood. They are gods in human form or descendants of gods. Authority flows through their lineage. It is a function of who they are. In early Chinese thought, the mandate of heaven is granted or withdrawn depending on virtue. It is judged, evaluated, revoked through catastrophe or rebellion. But it is not usually imagined as a kind of object that physically travels from place to place. In Greek tradition, rulers can claim divine favor or descent from heroic ancestors, but kingship itself is not portrayed as a separate item handed down from Olympus. The Sumerian picture is different. Kingship is something separate from the human being who holds it. The king list reinforces this through its phrasing. It does not simply record a succession of rulers in a single city. It traces the movement of kingship itself from city to city. Eridu to Bad Tibira to Larak, Larak to Sipar, Sipar to Shurupak. After the flood, it moves again to Kish, to Uruk, to to other centers. Each transfer is marked by the same kind of formula. City X was defeated, and its kingship was carried to City Y. Carried. Not merely usurped or inherited. Kingship is almost treated as a physical asset, like a cult statue, or a sacred object moved from one temple treasury to another. In this logic, a king does not generate authority. He borrows it. He rents it. He occupies an office that existed before he was born and will exist after he dies. Above the person is the framework, and the framework's origin lies not in human decisions, but in heaven. This model surfaces in other texts as well. A lament over the destruction of describes the goddess Ningal pleading for her city. The plea is denied. The text emphasizes that the gods grant kingship, but that no city's kingship is eternal. It is always temporary, always conditional. The hymn to Inanna portrays her as the holder of the me of kingship, the essential element that allows royal power to function. In one narrative cycle, she travels to Enki in Eridu, tricks him into surrendering dozens of me, and carries them off to Uruk. Among them is kingship. The result is a sort of political crisis among the gods. Authority has shifted location because the underlying packages that allow civilization to operate have been moved. The implication is unmistakable. Kingship is divine property. Human rulers are at best administrators operating at the edge of a network they did not design. So, when the king list states that kingship descended from heaven, it is not using a vague metaphor about legitimacy. It is making a concrete claim about origin governance, and its fundamental form came from somewhere above and outside regular human society. The question again is not only whether that claim is objectively true. The deeper question is why the Sumerians needed to present their power structures this way. One possible clue lies in how they measured the earliest holders of that kingship. The same king list that traces kingship's downward descent and geographic transfer also presents the reigns of the oldest rulers in terms that resist easy explanation. Those vast lifespans are not thrown out loosely. They are constructed from precise repeating numerical units. The early section of the document does not simply say, Alulim reigned many thousands of years. It ties his reign to a system of measures built on base 60, the same base that underpinned Sumerian mathematics, timekeeping, and surveying. Again and again in the antediluvian section, reign lengths are exact multiples of specific units. This is not random. This is not approximate. Someone was counting something with the same kind of care they used for grain rations and field measurements. But if the earliest kings ruled for spans that no human organism could endure what exactly was being measured, some modern interpreters have tried to rescue these numbers by converting them, treating them as lunar cycles, or as symbolic years, or as ways of counting generations. When divided just right, a 800-year reign can be turned into a more plausible number. Yet the text itself gives no hint that such conversions should be made. Later in the same document, when it reaches rulers whose existence can be independently verified, it uses ordinary year counts that line up reasonably well with other data. The scribes knew how to write a normal 12-year reign. They did so when it applied. They simply did not do that in the earliest part, and they did not explain why. Later copyists, centuries into the future, writing in different dialects and under new empires, kept those early numbers intact. They did not standardize them. They did not add notes to soften them. They copied. So, the king list becomes a bridge that starts in a realm of impossible time, measured with careful math, and then slowly walks down into plausible time, and then finally into demonstrable history. The document itself never pauses to mark where the impossible becomes the possible. The crossing is silent. Once again, the Sumerian scribes behave less like storytellers and more like archivists. They preserve a chronology they cannot fully align with their own reality. They measure a time that does not behave the way time is supposed to behave, and they leave it there as if their duty is fidelity, not clarity. And through all of this, the claim holds kingship is a thing that came down, moved across cities, and always stood above whoever temporarily wore the crown. The silence around those strange units of time is one kind of problem. The specificity of space is another. If the Sumerian texts are evasive about when the Anunnaki ruled, they are surprisingly concrete about where. The gods in this system do not live in some distant, undefined heaven. They are anchored to cities. They are tied to addresses. Enki is repeatedly called the Lord of Eridu. Enlil rules from Nippur. Nana, also known as Sin, presides over Ur. Inanna is queen of Uruk. Ninhursag is linked to Adab. Utu is rooted in Sippar. Ningirsu governs Lagash. These bonds between deity and city are not treated as symbolic associations or as simple patronage relationships. They look more like official jurisdictions. A collection known as the Sumerian temple hymns, usually dated to around 2300 BCE, reads, almost like a divine directory. Each hymn addresses a particular temple in a particular city, names the deity residing there, and sets out their portfolio. One temple oversees the subterranean waters and ritual purification. Another manages storm and political decision-making. Another regulates the lunar calendar and oversees herds and trade. The level of geographical and functional detail is striking. Sometimes the texts even mention fields and boundary markers associated with a god's estate. One debate poem that pits hoe and plow against each other references Enlil's lands in Nippur with enough specificity to sound like a property description. In the hymn to Inanna's temple in Uruk, the architectural details accumulate gates, courtyards, chambers, storage rooms, living quarters. This is not the language of misty, symbolic houses of the gods. It reads like an inventory of a functioning complex. Compared with other ancient pantheons, this is unusual. Greek gods have a home base on Mount Olympus, real, but separate from civic government. Norse gods occupy Asgard, distinct from Midgard. Egyptian gods often have favored cult centers, but they are primarily conceived as vast, cosmic forces whose connection to specific buildings is only one aspect of their nature. In Sumer, that pattern is reversed. The Anunnaki are not cosmic principles who occasionally appear in cities. They are resident powers who also control cosmic domains. They are shown on cylinder seals acting in very human settings, seated on thrones in buildings with recognizable architecture, receiving offerings from priests and officials, inspecting what are clearly irrigation works fields or administrative records. Some seals show Nintu or Ningirsu holding or overseeing tools. Others depict Nana with scribes' tablets in their hands, as if he is reviewing ledgers. The gods in these images are not distant. They look like supervisors. Texts also describe disputes over territory that read uncomfortably like human border conflicts. In the tale of Inanna and Enki, Inanna goes to Eridu, gets Enki drunk, and persuades him to hand over numerous me. She loads them on a boat and sails them back to Uruk. Enki sobers up, realizes what has happened, and sends emissaries to stop her. She reaches home anyway. The result is a permanent transfer of cultural authority. Another text recounts a conflict between Lagish and Uma over land, in which the god Ningirsu acts as a direct party in the dispute. Boundary stones bear his name. The line between divine and civic ownership blurs. Temple archives from cities like Girsu record offerings delivered to individual gods in almost bookkeeping language. This much bread, this much beer, this number of animals allocated to specific deities on specific days. The tablets even specify locations within temple complexes. The gods in this logic do not just symbolize administration, they are embedded in it. Travel narratives continue the pattern. One text follows Nana's journey from Ur to Nippur, listing every city past every local god who comes out to greet him. It has the rhythm of a diplomatic itinerary, more than that of a mystical vision. Put together, these threads form a coherent picture. The Anunnaki function in the literature like high officials in a bureaucracy. They hold office control districts, manage resources, travel with retinues, involve themselves in legal and border matters. They do all of this while remaining, at least in part, more than human. Which raises another question. If they govern like officials, what was the broader structure? They were officials of what larger state, what higher system did this divine council belong to? The texts do not define it. They do not name the overarching entity. They simply show the machinery would be familiar to anyone living under an organized state: councils, decrees, disputes, inspections, property records. The gods sit inside a framework that never becomes fully visible. This sense of partial revelation that something is there, but only the edges can be seen, comes into sharpest focus in the flood narratives. Because in those stories, the same gods who appear so firmly in control are suddenly shown confronting something they cannot manage. And their behavior in the middle of disaster looks less like that of all-powerful creators and more like that of officials whose policies have spiraled beyond their control. The oldest Sumerian flood account we know, often called the Eridu Genesis, describes the decision to send the deluge as a group action. The gods assemble, they agree, they decree the flood. On the surface, that looks familiar. Many cultures have stories of a divine council deciding to wipe out noisy or corrupt humans. But what happens next in the Mesopotamian versions is different. As the waters rise in the Atrahasis epic, Enlil seeks to control the catastrophe, closing water sources, attempting to contain what he has set in motion. It does not work. The flood grows beyond what he intended. The texts describe the gods retreating upward into the highest heavens, where they huddle at the edge of the cosmos. The image is not majestic, it is desperate. The word used is cowering. The gods crouch like dogs against the outer wall. They press themselves into the corners of heaven, watching a world drown beneath them. This is not the picture of detached omnipotence found in many later religious traditions. This is the picture of a council that triggered forces it can no longer steer. Then comes a detail that would almost be darkly comic if it were not so revealing. During the flood, with humanity gone, there are no more sacrifices, no more temple offerings, no bread, no beer, no meat. In several versions, the gods begin to suffer from hunger and thirst. Their lips dry, they grow weak. They are not abstract beings, unaffected by material flows. They depend on the ritual economy they themselves designed. When the waters finally begin to recede, and the human survivor, Ziusudra, in one version, Utanapishti, in another, offers a sacrifice, the texts say that the gods gathered like flies over the altar. That simile is sharp. It strips away the aura of serene, untouchable divinity and replaces it with a picture of beings crowding, driven by need. Ishtar, or Inanna, in some versions, cries out in anguish. She admits that she ordered the destruction, that she commanded evil in the divine assembly, and asks how she could have done that to the very people she herself brought forth. This is not the speech of a figure beyond consequence. It is a speech of regret. Enlil, encountering the survivor and his boat, reacts with shock and fury. No human, he says, was supposed to live. Ea Enki rebukes him. The rebuke is not religious. It is administrative. Enlil is called unreasoning. He is accused of acting without proportionality, without distinguishing between degrees of guilt. The idea is simple. You do not annihilate everyone for the wrongdoing of some. You scale punishment. You calibrate it. This is not how a wise governor behaves. The story reaches a turning point when the gods swear an oath they will not send such a flood again. The promise is not just emotional, it is legal. they bind themselves to a new policy. This pattern sets the Mesopotamian flood apart from many others. In the biblical version, the deity is never portrayed as scared, hungry, or out of control. The destruction is complete, deliberate, and held firmly inside a larger plan. In Greek tales of Zeus and the flood of Deucalion, the gods remain untouched observers. They escape all consequences. The disasters they send never threaten their own survival. In the Sumerian and Akkadian material, the Anunnaki misjudge. They miscalculate. They unleash a force whose duration and effects they did not fully anticipate, suffer from it, and then place constraints on their own future actions. This is not how omnipotent beings behave. It is, however, how rulers and officials behave when a policy goes catastrophically wrong, when damage estimates outrun expectations, when side effects grow larger than the original problem, when those who made the decision have to face the fallout and then quietly pass new rules to prevent a repeat. The flood in this light does something crucial. It cracks the image of total divine control. It reveals dependence and vulnerability at the heart of the supposed governors of Earth. And from that crack, another question emerges. If these gods could not completely control the very disaster they themselves initiated, what did they truly control? The answer in Sumerian thought appears to lie in something more specific than storms or water. It lies in the realm of knowledge itself, in the me, those underlying packages of function and order that define civilization. The gods may not have held absolute command over nature, but they did hold trade and sometimes lose control over the frameworks that shape human society. And it is in the stories about those me how they are given stolen, reassigned, that the Sumerian view of humanity's role comes into sharpest focus. According to the Sumerian texts, what the gods truly controlled after the flood was not weather, not earthquakes, not the raw forces of nature, at least not in any reliable way. What they controlled was something more focused, and in a sense more terrifying. They controlled the templates that make civilization possible. Those templates are gathered under a single word, me. The term appears in dozens of tablets. Translators render it as divine decrees, cosmic ordinances, fundamental attributes. None of those quite fits. The me are not vague laws. They are described as discrete items, each with a distinct function, each treated almost like a tool or a device. Lists of Miname, kingship, priesthood, truth, writing, metalworking, building, agriculture, music, warfare, judgment, craft after craft, role after role. Even the ability to descend into the underworld and return from it is described as a specific me, a particular capability that can be possessed or not. And crucially, each me can be held, it can be stored, it can be transferred, it can be stolen. One of the most revealing compositions is the tale often called Inanna and Enki. In it, Inanna, already a powerful goddess, travels to Eridu, the city of Enki, to obtain the me. She does not discover them through trial and error. She does not create new ones. She arrives knowing that these packages of power already exist in Enki's possession. Through hospitality, flattery, and eventually intoxication, she persuades Enki to hand them over. They are loaded onto a boat sent upriver to Uruk. When Enki sobers and realizes what he has given away, he sends emissaries to intercept the cargo to reclaim what he lost. He fails. The Emmy arrive safely in Inanna's city. Their transfer is complete. The story can be read as mythic drama, but its logic is administrative. A set of capabilities, kingship music craftsmanship law is located in one jurisdiction, then relocated to another. Authority changes hands not by invention, but by reassignment. The pattern repeats in more down-to-earth contexts. The farmer's instructions, an agricultural manual, opens as if it is simply describing a father teaching his son how to farm. Yet within the same text, those instructions are traced back to a god Ninurta. The farmer is not passing on folk wisdom, he developed himself. He is relaying divine training that was once given to humanity as a whole. The hymn to the pickaxe credits Enlil with not just inspiring the tool, but fashioning it and demonstrating its proper use. The text pictures Enlil actually showing how to strike the earth, how to angle the blade, how to dig canals. This is not myth as metaphor. It reads like a claim that the technique itself was taught directly. Temple rituals in the Kish hymn follow the same logic. The goddess Nana in some versions is said to teach the rites to her priestesses, not to inspire, not to suggest, but to teach. The texts preserve the exact wording of prayers, the measured quantities of offerings, the timing of ceremonies. They function almost like technical manuals, not devotional poetry. Underneath these instructions lies an implication that rarely gets stated outright if humans are being taught who learned first. The Atrahasis epic provides one answer. Before humans, another group performed the labor, the Igigi. They dug the canals, they hauled the soil. They maintained the systems that kept cities and fields functioning. When they revolted, humans were created to take their place. An obscure fragment in the debate between copper and silver alludes to those who carried the earth before men. The line is brief and the text moves on. No elaboration, no identity, just the acknowledgement that there were those before. The Eridu Genesis uses the phrase to bear the yoke when describing the creation of humans. The choice of words suggests that a yoke, a burden, already existed, and that it was being shifted to a new neck. Taken together, these are not comfortable creation myths where humans blossom in a moment of divine inspiration. They are replacement stories, second-wave stories. Humanity steps into a role that was already defined, already occupied, and now suddenly empty. And then the narratives do something even stranger. They leave the fate of the previous workers unresolved. The Igigi vanish from the text after their revolt. Those who carried the earth before men are never identified. No account describes their end. They simply recede, leaving humans with their jobs, their tools, and perhaps their training. This leads back to the same quiet refrain: humans did not inaugurate the work of civilization. They inherited it. The Enki and World Order text takes this inheritance model and strengthens it. Enki moves from city to city, assigning functions, determining which place will specialize in what, which deity will hold which responsibility. He does not hold counsel with humans. He does not ask for suggestions. He decrees. Humans in this picture come later to learn their assigned roles. The world is not emerging around them from their innovation. They are being onboarded into a structure that precedes them. So again, the question returns: why would a culture capable of mathematics, engineering, urban planning, and complex economy tell its own story this way? As receivers, not inventors. As students, not pioneers. As replacements, not originals. The texts never pause to answer, but they do show something else. The gods themselves, the supposed designers of this order, do not form a simple unified hierarchy. Their own governance is messy, fragmented, and sometimes dangerously unstable. The Anunnaki are often imagined in popular culture as a single unified group, an all-powerful council moving in perfect agreement. The tablets themselves do not support that picture. What they reveal instead is a fractured assembly more like a parliament of rival factions than a smooth chain of command. One telling myth centers on a figure named Anzu, a being who steals the tablet of destinies. This tablet in Sumerian thought is not just a symbol. It is treated as a physical object that grants its holder the right to issue binding decrees over heaven and earth. When Anzu takes it from Enlil, the result is immediate paralysis. Enlil loses the power to pronounce destinies. The divine assembly is thrown into crisis. A council is convened. Heroes are needed to retrieve the tablet. Multiple gods are approached and refuse. They weigh the risk and decline the mission. Only Ninurta eventually accepts battle's Anzu and recovers the tablet. In this story, gods do not obey automatically. They negotiate. They say no. The structure of authority depends on a single object whose loss creates an emergency. Another narrative, often called Era and Ishum in later Akkadian form, describes a conflict between deities over who should govern Babylon. One god undermines another's authority, leading to disorder and disaster in the human world. The god traditionally identified as Babylon's patron withdraws, leaving the city exposed. The catastrophe is not framed as a metaphor for inner psychological states. It reads like a political crisis with cosmic stakes. Even light-hearted sounding texts like the debate between bird and fish follow a similar script. Two figures argue over which contributes more to civilization. The debate is presented evidence offered, and Enlil renders judgment. The language could almost be that of a court proceeding. The gods do not automatically know the answer. A formal decision has to be made. These stories do not show a simple top-down theocracy in which every command flows from an unquestioned center. They show a council that argues votes, hesitates, retracts, and sometimes loses control of its own instruments. The flood narratives magnify this pattern. As already seen, the divine assembly decrees the deluge, then cowers when it grows beyond expectation. Some resist the decision leak information to humans or challenge the logic afterward. The gods are not of one mind, and they are not equally competent. The same fragmentation appears in questions of presence and absence. Sumerian texts repeatedly describe major deities leaving their cities, withdrawing to heaven, or becoming difficult to access. These are not tidy, mythic deaths. They are departures. In laments over the destruction of cities, the first and most devastating blow is not the invading army or the crumbling walls. It is the departure of the resident gods. The god has left his house. She has left her city. They have gone like migrating birds. The verbs are physical: to leave, to go up, to depart. The curse of a god tells how Inanna removes her favor from Agade, taking her divine weapons and attributes with her. 7 other deities follow. The result is collapse, not because they die, but because they are no longer there. Other laments describe Enki-Nana or Enlil abandoning their temples. Not defeated, not slain, withdrawn. Earlier texts speak of gods dwelling physically in their sanctuaries, receiving offerings directly meeting priests face to face. Later prayers from the same cultural stream address those same gods as if they are elsewhere. Turn your face, incline your ear, look upon your servant. The language presumes distance. The shift is never explicitly narrated. There is no grand story announcing, from now on the gods will be remote. Instead, there is a gradual transition from immediacy to absence. The simile of migrating birds captures this hauntingly well. Birds leave. They are not destroyed. They may return or they may not. The absence is seasonal, cyclical, or permanent. The texts do not say. What is conspicuously missing from this entire universe of stories is a single definitive account of the great gods dying. Lesser figures may descend to the underworld and return in cycles. But the chief administrators of the pre-human order do not meet heroic ends. They simply step away. And cities feel the void. Temples stand. Ritual calendars continue. Offerings are still measured out in careful quantities. But the ones those offerings were designed for have in some sense gone elsewhere. This is perhaps the most disturbing image of all. A civilization maintaining systems, performing rituals, reciting formulas, carrying on schedules that were originally created for beings who are now absent, but not acknowledged as dead. A world in which the office remains, but the office holder has left. At this point, another reversal becomes hard to ignore. The Sumerians, often imagined as founders, appear instead as caretakers. The gods, imagined as eternal rulers, appear instead as officials who can resign, depart, or withdraw. And there is yet another layer. Because the Sumerians themselves, the scribes who wrote these tablets, insist that even they are not original witnesses to the events they record. They present themselves as copyists, archivists of something already ancient. On the edges of many cuneiform tablets in small script that might be easy to overlook, there are scribal notes, colophons that tell their own quiet story. Again and again, these notes say some version of the same thing. This text was copied from an ancient original, or from a damaged tablet, or from an old writing that was difficult to read. A colophon from Nippur mentions an ancient original which was unclear. Another, attached to a version of the Eridu Genesis, states that the scribe copied from old tablets that were broken. In other words, even in the 3rd millennium BCE, the Sumerians were already looking back at texts that were old to them. They were not inventing ex nihilo, they were preserving. By the time the Sumerian king list was compiled around 2100 BCE, the antediluvian section was describing reigns tens of thousands of years in the past. No living tradition could have carried those supposedly precise numbers by memory alone. No unbroken chain of eyewitnesses could have reached back that far. And yet the scribes did not treat those old sections as myth. They treated them as records. They brought the same mathematical care to those reign lengths that they applied to recent kings whose existence we can corroborate. They did not label the early portion legendary. They did not file it separately as story. They compiled it into a single continuous list. Elsewhere, temple inventories mention ritual objects described as being from the old temple or from before the days of the grandfathers. The priests handling them around 2000 BCE were already conscious that these artifacts came from an earlier phase of their own religious system, one whose exact contours they no longer understood. Ritual texts preserve prayers in archaic forms of Sumerian that later scribes themselves needed glosses to interpret. Imagine chanting a liturgy in a language that has shifted enough that even the priests now must consult translations. They did it anyway. The overall picture begins to resemble a culture maintaining a machine it did not design. The instructions are partially lost. The parts have been repaired and replaced multiple times. New operators train apprentices using manuals whose first pages are missing. Yet the machine is never turned off. Temples remain active, even if the deities they were built for are now more distant. Ceremonies are still held, even if no one remembers exactly why certain gestures were originally required. Tablets are still copied, even when the older layers of the story no longer fit any comprehensible framework. This is where the emotional weight of the Sumerian record starts to shift. The most unsettling aspect may not be the claims about pre-human kings, or about prior laborers, or about divine councils gone wrong. It may be the image of Sumerian scribes themselves thousands of years ago, grappling with material that confused them. Copying numbers they could not reconcile with any known lifespan, preserving references to beings whose existence they did not see, maintaining chronologies they could neither verify nor comfortably discard. They could have chosen to simplify, to scale down, to label some material metaphor and move on. Instead, they preserved. They were careful. They noted when originals were broken. They admitted when writing was unclear, but they resisted the urge to fix the record according to what made sense in their own time. By their era, the great gods had already grown distant. The old experience of deities dwelling bodily in temples had begun to fade into memory and ritual reenactment. Yet the scribes refused to recast those earlier accounts as fiction. They did not downgrade them. They transmitted them as faithfully as they could. What results is a layered archive, one civilization reviewing documents from something older, struggling to keep them alive, in a world that no longer resembled the one they describe. And then many centuries later, archaeology enters this scene. Modern scholars uncover the same tablets, translate the same signs, and find themselves in a position remarkably similar to that of the Sumerian scribes. Confronted with claims that are too organized to dismiss, too strange to accept, and too consistently preserved to ignore. Yet now another voice is added, the voice of physical evidence. And that evidence has its own silence. Archaeology, by its nature, deals with what remains. Tools, bones, ruins, pottery shards, inscriptions, layers of soil and ash. When those remains are abundant and clear, they can tell detailed stories about how people lived, what they ate, how they buried their dead, how their technology evolved. When they are sparse, they leave gaps. In the case of the Sumerian claims about pre-human kingship, impossible reign lengths, and divine administration of cities before humanity, the material record does something subtly but importantly different from what many assume. It does not refute those claims. It simply does not speak to them. No archaeological layer in Mesopotamia clearly displays the marks of a non-human civilization managing cities, canals, and agriculture before humans. There are no obvious traces of manufactured genetic changes indicating that humanity was engineered as a labor force. There is no unmistakable layer of geology corresponding to a global managed flood, exactly as described in the epics. But at the same time, there is no discovery that definitively proves these things could not have happened in any form. The claims sit in a space current tools cannot fully access. For many, the absence of supporting evidence is enough. Extraordinary claims, they argue, require extraordinary proof. Without it, the safest move is to treat the Sumerian accounts as myth, as culturally shaped storytelling whose apparent precision is just a function of their bureaucratic style. Yet there is an inversion here that is worth sitting with. Modern culture often frames myth as the product of ignorance. In this picture, early humans without science invent gods to explain thunder, drought, fertility, and death. Myths are humanity's first stumbling attempts at explanation, later replaced by more accurate knowledge. The Sumerian situation complicates that pattern. The Sumerian scribes whose tablets we read were not pre-civilized. They were fully urban. They managed complex legal systems and long-distance trade. They built and maintained canals requiring careful engineering. They calculated using base 60 mathematics sophisticated enough to still shape how we tell time today. These were not people groping in the dark, inventing stories to impose order on chaos. They were administrators of a high-functioning civilization. And that civilization, far from claiming to have invented its gods as explanations, instead insists that it inherited accounts about those gods and could not fully explain them. The confusion, in other words, runs backward. It is not that naive ancestors invented elaborate myths to explain thunderstorms. It is that a literate, organized, technically capable society looked back at records old, even to them, that described pre-human order, and they did not know what to do with those records. So they did the one thing they knew how to do. They archived, they organized the data into king lists. They filed the epics alongside tax records. They measured reign lengths with the same numerical tools used for land surveys. They anchored myths to city names, temples, and geographic details. They converted story into record as best they could, even when the story itself no longer fit within any stable frame. This turns a common assumption on its head. Perhaps mythology, at least in some cases, is not a sign of early ignorance. Perhaps it is the residue of lost knowledge. The after-image that remains when the original context, the explanations, the living institutions, the direct experiences that once made the stories coherent has eroded. What survives then are narratives, rituals, and numbers that are still carefully preserved, but no longer fully understood. When viewed from this angle, the Sumerian material takes on a deeper, more haunting quality. The 10 claims sketched across these tablets about humans arriving late, about kingship, descending, about pre-human laborers, about divine councils, making mistakes, about transferable packages of civilization, about gods who leave rather than die, about scribes, copying from damaged originals, about precise but impossible chronologies, about cities built before the time of the grandfathers, and about a world where myth and record bleed into each other, do not resolve into a clear picture. They remain what they always were, testimonies. Not proven, not disproven, not assimilated easily into modern frameworks of history or myth. Simply there, baked into clay. At this point, it is tempting to seek closure, to choose a side. Either these texts are just myths and should be read as symbolic expressions of human anxieties and hopes, or they are hidden history fragments of a literal pre-human civilization that left only textual traces. The tablets themselves resist that binary. On the one hand, they are too saturated with bureaucratic detail to be dismissed as pure symbolic invention. They track names, dates, cities, borders, and offices with the same style used in tax ledgers and legal codes. They embed the Anunnaki inside real geographies and administrative structures. They count reigns with mathematical rigor. On the other hand, they contain claims that exceed biological limits, geological timelines, and everything known about the development of human culture. Reign lengths of tens of thousands of years, fully formed cities before human labor. A world managed by beings whose existence as described does not fit into any recognized category. They are both too ordered to be myth alone, and too impossible to be history as we use the word. The Sumerians themselves seem to have stood in exactly this tension. They did not treat these accounts as mere fiction. They preserved them in their archives. They referenced them in ritual. They tied contemporary kingship back to that original descending crown. They aligned their own political system with the idea of delegated borrowed authority that had once belonged to non-human hands. At the same time, they added glosses, admitting that some of the texts they copied were already unclear. They acknowledged damaged originals. They did not attempt to smooth the contradictions or resolve the impossibilities. They lived with them. It may be that the deepest lesson these tablets offer is not about what did or did not literally happen before humanity. It may be about how a civilization behaves when it finds itself standing at the edge of its own understanding. The Sumerians did not erase what they could not explain. They did not close the archive on material that made no sense. They left the questions open. Humans were not here first. Kingship descended. The me were given, not invented. The gods governed as officials, not as abstract forces. They unleashed a flood they could not fully control, then swore never to do it again. They eventually withdrew rather than die. Their former cities survived, as shells maintained by priests and scribes who no longer had direct access to the beings those places were for. Later, that very civilization of priests and scribes became in turn a memory. Clay tablets lay buried in ruins. Colophons noting ancient originals went unread for thousands of years. Only in the last 2 centuries have those records been excavated, sifted, and laid out on the desks of modern scholars. And once again, a civilization for all its science, all its methods, all its frameworks, finds itself staring at texts it can read but cannot fully place. That is the rhythm that runs through everything encountered so far, a series of returns to the same quiet realization. We are not just reading about Sumer. We are watching Sumer read something older and struggle. Just as they once sat in their scriptoria copying claims about a pre-human world that no longer fit their present, we sit now in ours, physical or digital copying, and analyzing their copies of those same claims, feeling a similar gap between record and understanding. In this sense, the tablets become mirrors. They show how a culture responds when confronted with evidence that its own story might not begin at the beginning. How it reacts when it must place itself second in time, second in authorship, second in design. Some resist that idea and reinterpret the texts so that humans regain first place. Others lean into it, spinning speculative theories about lost ages and hidden builders. But the tablets themselves remain stubbornly simple. They say we were not first. They say we received. They say we remembered as best we could. What remains after all the detail and all the analysis is a series of unanswered questions that the Sumerian tablets have been asking for 5,000 years. If humans were not here first, what does it mean to live in a world that feels inherited rather than built? If kingship law and the structures of authority were not gradual, human creations but descended, how does that reshape the way power is understood? Not as something generated from below, but as something loaned from above. If every crucial piece of civilization writing agriculture, metalwork, music, ritual law, was framed not as a human breakthrough, but as a divine gift. What happens to the story of human progress? Does invention become reception? Does genius become memory? If the earliest rulers ruled for spans that no human body can endure, yet their reigns were recorded with such precise mathematical care, what were the scribes really counting? If gods can make catastrophic mistakes, misjudge the scale of disasters, starve when their economic systems break, and swear oaths to limit their own future actions, how different are they from the officials and rulers we know? Do they stand outside the system, or are they simply occupying an earlier layer of the same bureaucracy? If the great administrators of that pre-human order did not die, but withdrew, leaving cities and temples standing like shells after their departure, what does it mean to continue rituals for those who are absent but never declared gone? If Sumerian scribes were already copying from damaged originals, already struggling to understand archaic phrases and impossible numbers, what does that say about the depth of time between them and whatever first generated those accounts? If archaeology today can neither confirm nor definitively deny any of these claims, what is the honest position to take? Dismissal, blind belief, or something quieter, an open-ended curiosity that neither forces an answer nor forbids the question? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, if mythology, in at least this one case, looks less like the birth of explanation and more like the shadow left behind after explanation has vanished, what other stories might be residues of lost contexts rather than products of ignorance? The Sumerian tablets will not answer. They never have. They will sit as they have sat in museum cases and archives. They will continue to state with the calm of baked clay that humans arrived late, that kingship descended, that knowledge was given, that prior laborers existed, that gods governed like administrators, that they erred, that they withdrew, and that a civilization after them tried its best to preserve the memory of all this without understanding it fully. Perhaps that is where their deepest power lies, not in providing answers, but in forcing a different posture. A posture that accepts living with records that do not fit, that acknowledges there may be truths about the past that cannot be comfortably absorbed into either myth or history, that recognizes that being second in time, second in creativity, second in knowledge, is a position humanity has rarely been willing to occupy in its own stories. Sumer, for all its temples and kings and scribal schools, accepted that role on clay. It wrote over and over that it was not first, that it came after, that it received. In listening to these tablets today across millennia, there is an invitation to slow down and sit with that possibility, not to rush to fill the silence with theories, not to discard the records because they are inconvenient, but to dwell in that strange middle ground where testimony exists without confirmation and without refutation. For those who have traveled this far through the narrative, letting the outside world recede for a while, the questions linger long after the words end. If reflections like this resonate, if this kind of slow descent into difficult material feels worth the time, one of the quietest ways to support it is simply to remember it, to return to it, to share it with someone else who might also be willing to sit with unresolved things. The tablets will still be there. Clay remembers. The question is what and how we choose to remember with it.